Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at the shift in Conservative Party ideology under the new leader Liz Truss and her new Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. So there's some really interesting stuff that's going on. We're very early on in Liz Truss's term in office, but already we've seen a significant shift in economic policy. Now there are some really intriguing bits on this which feed into debates in between the New Right and One Nation Conservatives within the Conservative Party. There's some really interesting stuff in this about economic policy and conservatism, where we see a shift back to the ideas of the New Right. And I pose this question: Are we returning to the era of Thatcherism and Reaganomics of the 1980s? And if so, this is a very substantial shift from what we've seen under Boris Johnson, and particularly when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor. Now, the economic policy has changed quite markedly. Now, this really shows a shift at the top of the Conservative Party in terms of their ideology towards economic policy and a rejection of economic orthodoxy. Now, economic orthodoxy says government debt is bad. And essentially, what you have to do is you have to match up the amount that you tax with the amount that you spend, and you can't spend more without taxing more. So, for example, traditionally, the Conservative Party will point at Labour and go, you are the tax and spend party, we are the low tax, low spend party. Now, the difficulty in all this, and we look at the policies under Truss and Kwarteng, is that in the early days of Truss's time as Prime Minister, we had a massive spend in terms of bringing in essentially this cap on how much people and business will be charged for energy, and the fact that the government will borrow loads of money essentially to pay the energy companies to mean that our bills don't go up astronomically as it look like they're going to do. And then we get the announcement of massive tax cuts, kind of the biggest tax cuts since I think it's not 1988, and they are gigantic in terms of the amount they're cutting. Now, orthodoxy goes, you can't do both of those things. And traditionally, the Conservative Party talk about themselves as the party of kind of fiscal responsibility, and they would attack Jeremy Corbyn and other Labour leaders, kind of going, you're trying to spend money you haven't got. What are you doing? So how have we got this change? How does this all fit in? Now, at first, it did look like a continuation of the Boris and Sunak days, because they've got the pledge to deal with the rocketing energy bills. But then we get this bit of a shift. The cost of this support will not come from a windfall tax on gas and oil companies. The gas and oil companies and the energy companies will not be forced to forego profits, so they're not restricting the amount of profit they can make during the next couple of years. They're just restricting the prices that people and businesses pay. So where will all this money come from to go to the energy companies to keep their prices down? Well, it will come from government borrowing. So the government is going to give money to the energy companies. That money ultimately is money the government has borrowed, and so the taxpayers eventually will have to pay this back through some format or the other. Massive increase in government borrowing is something that Conservative parties generally try and avoid. Now, we had seen some changes to this under Sunak and Boris Johnson, where they were willing to borrow to pay because of things like the COVID crisis, things like the furlough scheme. But we'd started to see increases in tax. So, for example, we've got this huge extra cost of the NHS, and we'd seen the rise in national insurance essentially to put money back into that. So they kind of gone, well, we've spent loads of money during the COVID crisis, but we're now going to have to start pulling some of that back. We go back beyond Johnson, we go back to Cameron, then and Osborne, we've got that period of austerity following the economic crisis of 2008, where the Conservative government, coalition government, and then the Conservative government afterwards kind of went, there is no money, we're not spending any, so we're cutting public services, we're cutting this, we're cutting this, we're cutting that. So because when we all have to kind of make do with what we can because the money simply isn't there. All of a sudden, the same party, the Conservative Party, are kind of going, right, no, there isn't any money at the moment, but there will be in the future, so fine. We're going to spend money, we're going to cut taxes. We also see an ideological shift with the removal of caps on bankers' bonuses. And this signals a return to the idea of deregulation of economics. The new right, the new right ideologically dislikes the idea that limits will be put on profits or bonuses and things like that. But again, we're now harking back to, well, why was that in place? Well, that was in place because of what happened in times like the 2008 financial crisis, where in chasing the big bonuses, the bankers took undue risks, and that then caused the collapse of the bank. And then we had over a decade of paying all the money back after the government had to dig the banks out. So there was reasons why government brought in regulations, but actually what the Conservatives are saying now, under Truss and Kwarteng, is that to bring about growth in the economy, we need to remove these caps on things and to generate income and investment in the UK, and the banking industry will come flooding into London because of this. They can make more money. So let's have a look at the tax cuts that have been made. Well, Truss and Kwarteng have doubled down on this change in direction in terms of economic policy, and they've shown this through the first set of tax cuts. So the national insurance increases that have come in have been reversed. So from November, people will see more money in their pay packets because less national insurance will be being taken out. The new health and social care levy to pay for the NHS will not be introduced, which does beg some questions about how will the costs of social care and the NHS be paid for, and I'll try and look at the model that they're proposing in terms of what happens with that going forward. Standard rate of income tax will be cut by a penny. This is enormously expensive, and of course will hit wage earners across the board. But obviously, the more you earn, the bigger the impact that has. And this is shown. The other bit that shows that there's the high earners who are reaping the most benefit is the top rate of tax in the UK, which was a rate of 45p per pound for high earners on earnings over 150 grand. So there's a bit where you've got your tax-free allowance, and then you get your standard rate bit, which goes into 50 odd thousand, and then there's a bit when you pay 40p, and that goes up to 150,000, and then over 150,000 pounds you pay 45p in the pound for every pound you earned over 150 grand. Well, that top rate has been abolished, and therefore what essentially has just happened is all the high earners in the UK have just had a massive increase in their take-home pay. There was a rise in corporation tax, which Boris government had announced, going up from 19% to 25%, was due to happen in April. That will now not happen. And the threshold on which people start to pay stamp duty, which is a tax you pay on the value of a house when you buy it. There's different rates if you're a first-time buyer, if you're an ordinary buyer, but both of the thresholds have been put up by £125,000, which means that less people will pay tax when buying a house, and those who pay tax will pay less tax when buying a new house. So that's aimed at helping the housing market. One of the things that's really intriguing about this, and why I'm talking about a massive shift in ideology, is you might expect this degree of reversal of government policy if you'd had a change of government. But we've still got the same party in power. This isn't a Conservative Prime Minister coming in and stripping away a load of Labour Party taxes. This is a Conservative Prime Minister coming in and stripping away a load of Conservative Party taxes. So these are all things that were put forward by the previous regime. This is the tax system under the time of Boris Johnson, and going back into the time of May, and even back into Cameron, some of it. So a lot of it is reversing just Johnson, but some of it is going even further back. So this is a really massive shift and a completely different set of principles in play in management of the economy. Now, what's even more intriguing about this is we're told there is more to come. Kwasi Kwarteng has stated that these tax cuts are only at the beginning, and that there are more big announcements to come. And he's made a big play of the fact that there's big stuff coming, everyone to be excited about it. Speculations is this will include changes to tax regulations for those with large pension pots. Current regulations have led to some high earners, notably doctors, and obviously there's a concern with the number of doctors leaving work and the shortage of doctors. But one of the reasons given for this is that the regulations on pensions mean that doctors are often better off retiring early, because if they continue to work, their pension pot would get too big, and if your pension pot gets above £1 million, then you have to pay 55% tax on the money in the pot over £1 million. So you get to the point, oh, I paid all this money into my pension. If I continue working, continue paying into my pension, then I'm just going to get taxed on all the stuff that I put into it. So there's no point doing it. And so what this has done is it's discouraged people from continuing working and encouraged people to retire, which is probably good for them. But the argument that would come from Kwarteng and Truss is that that's not great for the economy, not great for things like the NHS, and therefore what should happen would be to change those regulations to incentivize people to stay in work and build up big pensions, which they can then live on and spend when they're older. And we are also potentially going to see significant tax reform for high earners again. So one of the things that happens at the moment is if you earn less than £100,000 a year, then you have a tax-free allowance, which is about £12,000–13,000. And so you don't pay tax on that bit of money, and then you start paying at the standard rate. And then when you get to £50,000, you start paying at 40p, and then it keeps going. And then you keep paying that amount, and then you went all the way up to 150, and then 150, you started paying 45p. Now, one of the other regulations is that if you earned over 100 grand a year, then essentially you lost your personal tax allowance, and so that so the government essentially increased the overall percentage at which you were taxed. Now, again, the principle was that there were the people who could afford to pay it, and they could afford to pay more and still have a good standard of living, and so it was okay. And the principle here is then going, well, no, that's not okay. So what this is doing is it's decentivizing people from working harder and increasing their income. So what we're going to do is we're going to give them the incentive back. So we're going to lower the marginal rate of tax, the actual percentage rate of tax that they are paying on that money, by giving them back their tax-free allowance. There is also talk of loosening immigration laws to help plug some of the skills gap in the UK. So some particularly skilled jobs, which there are a shortage of workers, and Truss and Kwarteng are talking about loosening the immigration laws to do that. It's not universally popular, I don't think, even potentially within the cabinet, but we are told that there will be announcements coming on that soon. So again, a big shift in policy, where one of the big things with Brexit and Conservative policy since then is about kind of reclaiming control of the borders, and now we've got a Conservative government a few months later talking about loosening immigration laws to get in more skilled workers. So we're seeing a massive shift in ideology, a movement towards more free market libertarian economics. Interestingly, also in the same announcement of all this other stuff, was a tightening of rules for those on benefits. So those on universal credit will have their benefits reduced if they don't hit job search commitments. 120,000 people will now have to do more in seeking work or see their benefits cut. Some Tory MPs, particularly those in seats won in the Red Wall, as it's often referred to in the North, but also in the Midlands, are worried that the contrast between this bit of being tougher on those on benefits whilst granting disproportionately high tax cuts to the rich will play very badly with the electorate in some of these traditionally Labour seats. It seems like an odd mix. The ideology behind it, in terms of why the Truss and Kwarteng would argue that this is joined up, and does make sense, is it's all about incentive. So you cut taxes for the wealthy because it incentivizes people to work hard and earn loads of money. You incentivize people on benefits to get off benefits and get into work. So it's all about creating incentive for people, and creating incentive creates economic growth. And if the economy grows, everything gets better. That is the ideology behind it. It's new right conservatism. It's often related to classical liberalism or neoliberalism, and it goes back to the ideas of Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. And again, some of the screens to what I've just said. So, and one of the key ideas that fits in with this is the idea of trickle-down economics. Now, whilst the most obvious gains in these kind of policy are for the wealthiest, and you'll see, I mean, particularly obviously the Labour Party will point to this and kind of go, look, this is the tax cuts you've just done. This is how much you benefit from it if you are a high earner. This is how much you benefit from it if you are a low earner. and the high earner benefits gigantically, and the low earner benefits hardly at all. So that's what the Labour and other people are going to say. Well, what this ideology says, this new right Reaganomics type idea says, well, what you can get is you get trickle-down economics, where actually the benefits initially, yes, they are for the wealthiest, but what that will mean is they will spend loads of money, and that money will then trickle down through the economy, and essentially the economy will grow and everybody will get better off. And people will have the incentive, and they'll see the people at the top earning loads of money and keeping hold of it, and they'll go, right, I want to do that as well. So this is a really controversial view. The trickle-down bit is there are lots of people who oppose this and say this just doesn't work. All it does is it creates wider gaps between the rich and the poor, and the money doesn't trickle down. In fact, loads of it leaks out of the economy and is either saved or is spent on luxury goods which are imported, or it's spent on foreign holidays, and things like that. And so the money actually leaves the economy. It doesn't kind of get re-injected into it lower down. The theory also goes that in the short term, government debt will grow, but in the long term, that issue will not remain. Government isn't a case that the government is just going to create a huge amount of government debt, and there will always be a huge amount of government debt. And there is this theory, in this the theory at least, that you can lower the tax threshold and actually increase the amount of tax you bring in. And I'm going to try and demonstrate that through the use of some fairly rudimentary diagrams. And the idea of this is big pie, small slice. So on the screen at the moment, I've got two different economies of different sizes with different amounts of tax. Percentage of the economy being taken in tax. So if we look at the first economy, the small one, so we say that was the economy at the moment. So the economy is small. I mean, and the Bank of England itself says we're in recession. So we say we've got a small economy at the moment, and we've got I've taken about a quarter of the economy out with tax. What Kwarteng and Truss argue is that with their economic policy, what's happened is the economy will grow. So we go from the little circle to the big circle. If you then look at the amount of tax that has been charged, it's less than a quarter now. It's a smaller percentage of what's been taken in tax. But actually the amount of revenue, that little segment there, is actually bigger than the segment of the smaller economy. It's a smaller, so on the big pie, it's a smaller slice, but the slice is still bigger than the big slice of a smaller pie. So if you went, if you were offered, in terms of your tea, you were offered a kind of a small slice of a big pie or a big slice of a small pie, you'd look at it and try and work out which way you were getting more pie. And what Kwarteng and Truss are saying is that yes, government revenue will go down in the short term, but in the long term it'll go up because the economy will grow. And yes, we'll be taxing at a lower rate, but we were taxing something bigger at a lower rate, so we'll get a bigger chunk of revenue ultimately. So that is the theory of low tax economy to generate growth and not in the medium to long term damage government revenue. There is, again, it's a theory, it is debated, it is argued about. Some people say this is absolutely true, and others say this is nonsense, and what you're just going to end up with is a huge amount of government debt. And then you've got the historical examples where you can go back and look at Reagan's America and Thatcher's Britain and go, well, did those economic policies work when they were used? Again, not everybody agrees, but there's been plenty of analysis done on it. Now, I think it's fair to say that the overall reaction to this has not been overwhelmingly positive. Labour are saying, well, this is cuts for the rich at a time where the cost of living crisis most acutely affects the less well off, and Starmer has immediately said that they would reverse the removal of the 45p tax. Labour also are saying, look, energy companies are being protected, whilst future taxpayers will have to pick up the tab for the energy price cap. So the government's friends in the energy industry are still going to make huge profits out of this extraordinary circumstances, and the people who are going to pay for it are going to be the ordinary people of Britain in the long term, particularly because the tax threshold has been moved away from the rich and towards everybody else. So the Labour Party are going to attack this, and one of the things which will help in an understanding of British politics is we are going to have a very definitive divide between Labour and Conservative now. That was more blurred under Johnson because Johnson was willing to spend money on stuff and put taxes up to pay, and was starting to put taxes up to pay for it. Whilst here we're seeing a very, very different approach. There does seem to be tension between the Bank of England and the government. So in the same week that Kwasi Kwarteng cut tax, the Bank of England increased interest rates from 1.75% to 2.25%, and stated that the UK economy was in recession. Now, the aim of rising interest rates is to combat what the Bank of England's job is to do, which is to combat inflation. Now, inflation is incredibly high at the moment, at about 10%. Now, so the Bank of England is increasing interest rates in an attempt to cool down the economy and prevent inflation, because if borrowing becomes more expensive for people, then they've got less disposable income, and so they spend less, and this tends to take demand out of the economy and force prices down. That's the theory. Obviously, the government's new tax policy is completely contrary to this. So because what they're doing is they're trying to put more money back in people's pockets to get them spending. So there's an argument here about which is the right approach. I mean, is the Bank of England doing the right thing, or is the government doing the right thing? Is the government's tax policy going to lead to runaway inflation? Is the Bank of England's increase in interest rates going to kill off the housing market and lead to a deeper recession? It's all economic theory. It's difficult to know the answer to that. One of the things it's going to be made even more difficult about if you've got two things running alongside each other. So that your take-home pay packet may go up, but your mortgage payment goes up as well, in which case, essentially, the money flows in from your employer and then out to the banks, who've just had the restrictions on their bonuses removed. So that bit kind of, they're going to, how the interaction is going to be interesting. What happens to inflation, whether we go into a deep and long recession or whether we get out of it very quickly, is going to be interesting to see. The stock market and the international markets were not big fans of the policy either. The pound fell very dramatically. It's almost down to $1 to a pound and €1 to a pound. So the pound is valued much, much lower than it normally is. The value of the UK stock market also fell. So the value of stocks in the UK fell. And essentially this is the market saying, we fear the government having high debt. We don't like uncertainty. We're not sure what this is going to do to the economy. We're not convinced it's going to be good. And therefore the market's reacted quite negatively. The other thing that's quite interesting in all of this is the interest rate that the UK government itself pays on international debt has risen to a high of 4%. Before the tax cuts and things, it was 3%. Earlier this year, it was under 2%. And this again suggests that the international finance industry is not convinced that the UK government is going the right way. We saw the worst day for government bonds in decades. So that's government bonds are where people buy slices of the government debt. The fact that the government is struggling to secure or sell its debts to other people suggests that people aren't convinced they're going to be able to pay it, which you can maybe understand with the government increasing spending and cutting taxes at the same time, something which orthodox economics tells us you can't do. Now, there is an interesting new line in economic theory which suggests things like government debt doesn't really matter, because a government can't really be in debt if you are also the person who prints the money. So, and there is some complex economic theory behind that, and it'd be interesting to see how some of this stuff plays out. But again, overall, the kind of, obviously the opposition have really taken out strongly against it. The economic markets have not been hugely thrilled. Now, having said that, not everything is a negative reaction. So this is well viewed by a lot of people as a return to Thatcherism. And a lot in the Conservative Party will welcome the return to radical Thatcherite economics. Truss won the leadership election for this reason, pretty much. Many in the Conservative Party were dismayed by Boris and Sunak's willingness to intervene in the economy, furlough, etc., and to raise taxes to pay for it. They see the Conservative Party as a low tax, low regulation, low intervention party, and under Boris Johnson, that they were becoming the opposite of that. They were the amount of tax being charged through the economy was a very, very high level. The government was intervening at every crisis, at every moment. They can, oh, this has happened, right, we'll step in and do something about it. There was regulation in the finance industry and all other things like that. One of the things that's interesting to remember on this is that Liz Truss was a Liberal Democrat, and there's a strong kind of classical and neoliberal strand to these policies in terms of the treatment of the economy. And so there are many in the Conservative Party who are really, really happy about the changes that are coming, and that will be reflected across the electorate. One Nation Conservatives, however, will be nervous about what's going on. They'll have memories of similar policies going out of the 80s and into the 90s, leading to really high interest rates, a kind of dangerously weak pound, high levels of unemployment, high levels of social division, and then ultimately one of the most catastrophic electoral defeats ever in 1997. And we've, as I've already mentioned, will the tax cuts for the rich and increased bankers' bonuses play well in constituencies? Marginal constituencies that Conservatives won off Labour in 2019. Or is this going to see the Labour regain a load of those seats? Is this going to be damaging? It is worth remembering, however, in all of that, that Thatcher won elections in 79, in 83 and 88. So the return to these kind of economic policies is not necessarily going to be damaging at the ballot box. Very many people in the UK are going to be very happy to see their take-home pay increase and their national insurance and contributions and taxes fall, and that may well impact on how they vote. I mean, one of the old adages of British politics, and it's the same I think applies in most democracies, is you come to the ballot box after the government's been in for however long, and a lot of people just ask themselves, do I feel better off than I did before these guys got elected? And if people feel better off than they were before this government came into office, no matter how much they disagree with other bits that they do, there's a good chance they will vote to keep them in, because they'll go, well, yep, don't like this, don't like that, but overall I'm better off. So the policies that we've seen over the last few days may well kick in, and that was a similar thing under Margaret Thatcher, where there was lots of people who embraced the opportunity, and they went, well, I'm starting to feel better off, and that won a lot of people around to the Conservative Party in the 80s, and Truss and Kwarteng will be hoping to do the same again. So I hope that's explained a bit. As I said, it's really helpful for stuff you are doing if you're doing Conservative ideology and looking about where that is. And this is certainly seeing a rise of the new right, and Truss and Kwarteng seems very much from that mould rather than the One Nation Conservative. It's obviously it's really important if you're doing component 2 and you're doing political parties, and it shows you about the changes and the shifts in the factions and the direction of the Conservative Party and its policies. And the policies under Truss and Kwarteng, even in a few days, look very, very different from the policies of their Conservative predecessors. So Johnson's government was a very different government to what we're seeing now, and that change in economic policy is a really interesting one. There are about 170 videos I've done on various parts of UK and US politics and ideology. So if you are studying A-level politics, please subscribe, check out all the videos on the channel, cover all you need to know for the specification, hopefully. And there's also loads and loads of videos on here for various parts of history. So if you're doing A-level history, you might well find some stuff on there as well. Or if you're just interested in history and politics, there's plenty on the channel to keep you entertained and informed, I hope. Thank you very much for watching.